Classic WoW is a massive game, and there is a lot of stuff that people know about the game since it's been out for such a long time. However, there is a lot of interesting stuff and locations in the game that you guys probably did not know about. So with that being said, here are 7 things you never knew about Classic WoW. Starting off at number 7 is you can skin WORGENS. So in Classic World of Warcraft, you can actually skin Worgen NPCs. As we all know, Worgens are now a playable race that's got released in the Cataclysm expansion. Since the Worgen is now on the same level as humans, orcs, undead, and so on, they are seen in a different light. However, in Classic WoW, the Worgen were basically just seen as monsters, and the fact that you can skin them shows this to be the case. I don't know why, but it feels pretty creepy to skin Worgens to get their leather. Since Worgens are actually half human and half wolf that can go in and out of the form, technically you're actually skinning a human that is just in the Worgen form. I believe this didn't last long, and I think in Classic WoW is the only time when you can actually skin Worgens in game. Either way, this is pretty gruesome to think about. I think it's a good idea that Blizzard changed this. This is kind of a bit brutal considering. I mean, imagine beating a Worgen in PvP and then skinning him. Number 6 on this list is PANDAREN in Classic WoW. Yes, you heard me correctly, there is actually PANDAREN in Classic WoW. Now we all know of the PANDAREN that came in Mist of Pandaria, which was its own playable race, an entire continent of Pandaria to explore. In addition, in Warcraft 3 there was a very brief cameo of Chen Stormstout, which I believe is the first ever significant lore character that was a PANDAREN, and up until Mist of Pandaria we pretty much never heard from the PANDAREN. However, this is not the case in Classic WoW. Actually, in Classic WoW, there were quite a few hints that PANDAREN were an actual race of people, with some very scarce clues scattered around the world. For instance, there was a short quest chain that involved the empty keg of Chen Stormstout, but you never actually saw him or any PANDAREN model. However, in the Swamp of Sorrows, there's some very interesting stuff. For instance, as you're going into the Swamp of Sorrows, you may actually find an interesting looking bridge. Now, most people playing Classic WoW back in the day never really thought of it as anything noteworthy, it's just an interesting looking bridge. However, if you really think about it, this is definitely inspired by PANDAREN architecture, and by the looks of this bridge, it is extremely old, so if PANDAREN actually made this bridge, they are long gone. You may think that is kind of a stretch, however, this is not the only piece of evidence that PANDAREN used to reside in the Swamp of Sorrows. If you go all the way out to the coast with the Murlocs, you can find a bunch of skeletons of turtles, and on top of these turtles, there looks to be some kind of PANDAREN saddle. It's kind of like the roof of a pagoda, which is very common in PANDAREN architecture, and considering that the PANDAREN often ride on turtles and turtles is kind of a big thing in their culture, it's pretty much all but said that these are actually the mounts of PANDAREN, that PANDAREN at some point was on the continents of World of Warcraft Classic. But the interesting thing is that everybody that played World of Warcraft Classic at the time had no idea that this was actually a teaser for the PANDAREN race. To this day, it's still a mystery as to what happened to these early settlers from Pandaria that came to the Eastern Kingdoms. The Swamp of Sorrows is a very inhospitable place in the game, so the PANDAREN might have came here and got wiped out. Number 5 on this list is the Dungeon Finder. Now, as we all know, the Dungeon Finder is a pretty big deal in the current version of BFA. Modern WoW has a very big emphasis on the Dungeon Finder, whether that be the random Dungeon Finder or the pre-made group finder. This is the go-to way to find a group for a raid content or dungeon content. Although I don't like the idea of a random dungeon finder, the system works pretty well for what it's designed to do. You select a damage role, a healer role, or a tank role, and then you get assigned into a group based on your specialization. However, in Classic WoW, there was the early stages of the Dungeon Finder. You can actually find a bunch of dungeon meeting stones that are just outside of dungeon instances. However, these meeting stones were kind of envisioned by Blizzard to be a place where people come to meet up other people that want to run the dungeon. However, this never actually took off. Nobody did this back in the day, and people always used chat channels to play through a dungeon with. There is an auto group feature, however you have to go all the way to the meeting stone, which is just outside the dungeon, and even then you're not actually assigned based on your role. You can't actually select if you're a damage dealer, a healer, or a tank. You just automatically get grouped up with other people that have clicked on the same meeting stone. So mode was pretty useless. I'm not sure what Blizzard is going to do when they actually release Classic WoW. Will they keep this archaic system in that nobody will use? To be honest, if Blizzard completely removed this, it wouldn't make any difference. That is how few people actually use the meeting stones in Classic WoW. Number 4 on this list is mob immunities. So in Classic WoW, there was a very interesting mechanic where if you use an elemental spell to an enemy with a certain element type, that enemy will take 0 damage. It won't be resisted, it won't take partial damage, it will literally be immune to your attack. And even mechanical enemies were immune to bleed effects, something that in today's BFA doesn't exist. And this was a really big deal back in the day, even for max level characters. Most notably, the raid Molten Core was the perfect example of this. Literally everything in there was immune to fire damage, so if you were a fire mage, you would literally be useless. You couldn't do a single point of damage to any of the mobs in there, so you were forced to play as a frost mage. And even in Blackwing Lair, there was quite a few cases where some mobs were immune or had heavy resistance to fire damage, so any person that was playing a mage was forced to go into frost spec instead of fire spec, and only in Anchorage could they actually play as a fire mage and actually do any damage. The fire spec was actually pretty good in Classic WoW, and it is actually slightly better than Frost when it comes to DPS when you're well geared. It's just that you can't actually go into that spec because of the mob immunities. Mages were definitely the hardest affected by mob immunities in Classic WoW, but throughout the leveling process you will inevitably come across some mobs that are immune to your spell elemental school. In today's BFA this doesn't affect anything. You can play as a fire mage and go into Molten Core and kill anything you want, but back in the day this wasn't the case. Number 3 on this list is Paladins had no ranged attack. This is kind of inconceivable in BFA, where every character has its own solutions to different problems. Every character has its own stun, own crowd control, own burst damage, own self-heal, shield, movement speed increase. Like every character is hyper balanced so that they have pretty much everything in their toolbox. However, Classic WoW was not built like that. Certain classes could only do certain things. In addition, some classes literally couldn't do a thing, and Paladins using ranged attacks was one of them. I believe Paladins is the only case where a class had no ranged attack. The closest thing Paladins had to a ranged attack was Judgment, however that was 10 yards, so it doesn't really count. That's basically just the melee range of a Tauren. If you want to play as a Retribution Paladin in Classic WoW, get used to only using melee attacks, because they really do not have that many spells up their arsenal. Number 2 on this list is hidden stats. So in BFA the stats are pretty much normalized. Every stat is useful to you in some way, and if you go into your character page it breaks it down as to how it exactly benefits you to a specific number. You can find out how every piece of gear gives you certain benefits and increases certain attributes to a specific number. However, the Classic WoW character page was a bit barren when it came to detail. Surprisingly enough, if you go onto your character page, it doesn't actually tell you what your critical strike chance is. To find this out, you actually have to go into your spellbook and hover over your melee attack, and it will finally tell you what your critical strike chance is. This is a very weird quirk, but it also applies to parry chance and dodge chance. At no point can you find this information out on your character page, but what is more interesting, spell critical strike chance is not viewable anywhere. There is actually no way to find out in-game what your critical strike chance is for spells. You kinda have to add it up yourself by the equipment pieces you own and do some calculations with your intellect if you're a caster DPS. It's pretty weird not being able to find out what your spell critical strike chance is, and in addition there's no way to view your haste. So number 1 on this list is hidden TBC zones. So way before the Burning Crusade dropped, we were given lots of teasers and leaks by explorers as to the upcoming zones that will come in TBC. The most famous example of this is there's actually a way to get into the Caverns of Time early before the Burning Crusade ever came out. By doing a little bit of wall jumping near the back of the Caverns of Time, you can actually get inside and explore what it's like. This amazing looking zone really captivated us when we were playing Classic WoW. It was a huge leak, to be honest, as we clearly knew that this was something of major importance. And just think about it, Blizzard actually puts future expansion content into the game world that you can literally get to. To put this in perspective, can you imagine if Blizzard put in future expansion content into the game world and someone leaked it? It would be an insane deal, but that is what it was like when we first saw videos of people getting into the Caverns of Time, and sure enough, the Caverns of Time was a major part of the next expansion. However, this was not all. Some glitchers actually found a hidden outland that was in the Deadmines instance. This is a really cool place to explore, and believe it or not, but it's actually still in the game today. It's clear some programmers at Blizzard were experimenting with some assets they had from Hellfire Peninsula on the outskirts of the Deadmines. They probably never imagined anyone would get here, but this is a really freaky place. In addition to some floating rock assets that would be in Hellfire Peninsula, there was also these really unique floating trees. Now I believe these floating trees never actually made it into the game. I think they were only here in this hidden part of the Deadmines. People speculated that these trees were actually planned to be in the Emerald Dream, a zone that never actually got launched. Not only that, but there's also these upside down Dalaran bubbles that just look really freaky. This is definitely one of the most interesting places in World of Warcraft history. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like down below. This is vaulty, signing out.